Peter was extremely pleased with himself as he emerged from the trading post, and it showed in his expression.
Good news?
Elizabeth asked. Peter nodded, beaming. Some good, some bad. I believe I have made a sale. I managed to talk them into giving me an advance. Unfortunately, the equipment and materials I require will take up most of it. However, at this he counted out several small coins into his palm. I should be able to spare a little for each of you, for a bite perhaps. I did see some food for sale in the trading post. Peter leaned close to Elizabeth and added, Just remember, you pay before you eat. Elizabeth might have been insulted, but Peter said it with such a charming, playful sparkle in his eye, she felt more like laughing. Peter tipped his cap to her. Now then, it appears I have some business to attend to. But as Peter turned and began walking away, Stu scampered after him. Hey, wait! Y'all got a moment? Peter didn't stop, but he did slow a bit for Stu to catch up. What's on your mind? Stu glanced over his shoulder at Elizabeth. She was watching the two of them with a look of immense curiosity on her face. Well, it's kinda personal. Y'all mind talking in private? Peter halted and leaned down, close to the ground, close to Stu. Well, I feel kinda silly asking this and all, but, what do y'all know about women? Peter stared blankly at Stu and thought. Well, I know all creatures begin their lives female until a certain stage of development, except of course for asexual. No, I mean, like, what do they want? How do y'all get their attention? Well, I suppose that depends on the species. Mountain goats, for instance, ram their heads together to... Stu jerked his head in Elizabeth's general direction. What about that woman there? Peter mused. Well, to be honest, I think you have more experience than I. Didn't you say you were married once? Yeah, but she was a shrew. Peter shrugged. Well, yes, I expect so. No, I mean, she was a real shrew. Peter blinked. Is there a reason she wouldn't be? No, I mean... Stu paused. Forget it. Peter glanced to his shoulder where Matrix was perched. The spider simply shrugged. Well, I'm afraid I won't be much help. Perhaps you should consult Matrix. What, the fuzzy boy? Matrix puffed out his chest in pride. As I understand it, he's quite the he-man. At this, Matrix raised an ornate little sword towards the sky and jabbered something unintelligible in his squeaky little voice. Stu stared, unbelieving at the silly little creature. That is a chick magnet? He claims to have fathered thousands of young in his time. Uh-huh, Matrix nodded. Peter gave Stu a pat on the shoulder and winked. Good luck, lad. Matrix scuttled along Peter's arm and took up a perch on the top of Stu's head. Oh boy, Stu muttered, looking up into the spider's unblinking eyes. This gonna take some getting used to. Peter stood up, gave Elizabeth a wave, and turned away. Elizabeth cocked her head to the side, smirking as she watched Stu trudge back.
And what was that all about?
Stu, preoccupied with the spider on his head, jumped as he heard Elizabeth's voice. Oh, that? Well, For a moment he considered coming clean, but a shake of Matrix's head dissuaded him. That was nothing. Science stuff. Yeah, Pete's a smart guy. Elizabeth mused, looking back at where Peter had been standing.
Maybe I should talk to him sometime.
Stu began to protest, but Matrix slapped a limb over his mouth. Elizabeth raised a curious eyebrow as she saw the suspicious pose.
What are you two doing?
Matrix pointed at Stu and faked a sneeze.
Right,
Elizabeth muttered, unconvinced. Stu flicked the spider's leg aside and spoke up. Well, Elizabeth, if y'all excuse us, we got stuff to work on. With that, Stu darted around the side of the trading post and out of sight. Elizabeth was left shaking her head.
All morning. He can't wait to get a moment of my time. And now that it's just us, he has to go.
Elizabeth chuckled and shrugged.
I don't understand men.
Stu, meanwhile, paused just a moment to sigh in relief. Then, quite serious, he looked up at Matrix.
Okay, Fuzzy. Pete says y'all are a ladies' man. What's the secret?
Matrix turned his head in either direction, peering about conspiratorially, and then crawled down Stu's back and scuttled along the wall. He turned back long enough to motion for Stu to follow him, and then continued on his way. Stu followed, intrigued in spite of himself. Matrix leapt off the building as the two passed beyond its walls. There, ahead, shining in the sun, were the silver threads of a spiderweb, spun between the branches of a dry twig. Matrix turned back to Stu, pointed to his front eyes, and then pointed to the web.
Y'all want me to watch?
Uh-huh. Matrix scuttled off the twig and crawled up to the edge of the web. He plucked at one of the outermost threads, sending a wave of vibrations washing over the web. There was a light ringing sound, not unlike a doorbell. Several legs unfolded from behind a branch of the twig, and a second spider emerged from her hiding place, peering about for the intruder. "Yoo-hoo!" Matrix squeaked, with a wave of one limb. As the other spider spotted him, Matrix set a sombrero on his head, shook a pair of maracas with his mid-front limbs, and raising a trumpet to his mouth with the frontmost, he broke into an impromptu performance of La Cucaracha. The other spider visibly blushed and gave a light giggle. She then fastened a bib under her mouth, and holding up a knife and fork, charged down the web after Matrix. "Yarp!" Matrix squeaked, and he dashed down the side of the twig, while the other spider gave chase. Stu watched in amazement as the two spiders raced in circles and figure eights around the twig, then away, then back, then up Stu's back and down his arm.
Whoa, whoa!
Stu exclaimed as the many legs tickled his skin. Then the spiders were off again, leaping through the dry grass, scuttling in circles around the twig, faster, faster, so that Stu's eyes could barely follow their movements. At long last, the female spider collapsed into the dust, breathing heavily, her legs splayed out in all directions. Matrix, meanwhile, crawled back onto Stu's head and spread his front limbs with a squeak of, "Oh?"
Well, that works fine for y'all, but how do I get Elizabeth to chase me?
Matrix just shrugged.
You know, I had a dream the other night,
Stu mused. He began pacing back towards the trading post as he thought aloud. Matrix crawled down Stu's back and scuttled along beside him.
See, I was this masked vigilante crime fighter. I called myself Stu Man Shrew. We were all back in the city, right? Bilge and Mickey were chasing after Elizabeth.
"Hurrah!" Matrix growled at the mention of the rat and his lackey.
Yeah, those guys. So I jumped out and I beat up Bilge, and Mickey got scared and ran off. Then I saved Elizabeth, and she was all grateful, and now what's so funny?
Matrix had fallen behind, rolling on the ground, laughing as hard as a spider can laugh, clutching his aching sides. Stu sighed and looked at the ground.
Yeah, y'all are right. It was a silly dream.
Hey, that ain't so silly. Yap had ventured outside to take out the trash. He dumped it in the usual spot behind the building, a growing pile of refuse that would have turned even a rat's stomach. While doing so, he had seen and overheard the whole thing, from Matrix's seduction attempt to Stu's musings.
Last night, I dreamed I was a dragon, and I owned the post and everything inside. Then I tried to breathe fire, but all that came out was a bunch of moths, and they ate all the clothes. Then we went out of business. But it was neat while it lasted.
Stu just stared up at Yap.
Yeah, that's nice.
Oh, yeah, very nice.
Yap sighed, gazing dreamily into the distance. As Stu began walking again, however, a cunning gleam flared to life in Yap's eyes, and he called out,
"Hey, wait!"
Quick as a flash, Yap slithered up alongside Stu and clapped a hand across his shoulder.
What do you say if I could make that dream come true?
I'd say y'all got a bridge to sell too.
Yap paused a moment, his last handful of brain cells burning out deciphering the remark.
I don't get it.
Never mind.
Oh, wait.
Yap scampered after Stu.
Just come inside and have a look, eh? Don't like it, don't buy it. Cost you nothing, just to look, right?
Stu glanced up at Matrix. The The spider answered with a shrug and a nod.
Well, fine. I'll look.
Yap stifled a manic grin, and in a whirlwind of fur and motion, roughly ushered the little shrew around the front and through the entrance into the trading post. Inside, Yip was wearing a grin of his own. Not manic, perhaps, but very flirtatious.
No charge if you give me a kiss, sugar,
he was saying. A look of intense disgust crossed Elizabeth's face.
Just give me the price, and let me go.
Already have, sweetheart.
But I'm not even a ferret. I'm a mouse.
Honey, if a lady toad walked in, I'd kiss her too.
Hey, Yip!
Yap shouted, and darted behind the counter. Yip forced his grin to linger despite the grinding of his teeth.
I'm busy,
he muttered out the side of his mouth.
But Yip, it's real important.
Yap leaned close and added in a whisper,
I think I found a sucker for the suit.
Yip's ears perked up. His grin immediately relaxed.
The suit?
Yeah,
Yap added. Yip glanced to Stu and then back to Yap.
Does the thing?
Yap nodded. Yip leaned over the counter and addressed Elizabeth, his harsh voice suddenly smooth as silk.
That'll be $1.50.
In a flash, Elizabeth dropped the exact change on the counter, swept her meal into her arm, and darted out of the store. Yip twisted into a relaxed pose, resting his elbow on the counter, and smiled pleasantly in Stu's direction.
So, what can we do for you, shrimp? I mean, son?
We can make his dreams come true,
Yap giggled softly.
Eh?
Yip mumbled, leaning towards Yap.
How's that?
Yap whispered eagerly into Yip's ear, giggling all the while. Yip glanced in Stu's direction and raised an eyebrow as he looked Stu up and down. The corners of Yip's mouth twisted into a devious grin, and he began chuckling. Stu scowled at the laughing ferrets.
Right, I'm in now. Not so fast, Mac,
Yip shouted, darting after Stu. He whipped around, crossing in front of Stu, and jammed a finger into the little shrew's stomach.
We got just the thing for you. You just wait and see.
Yip gestured madly to Yap. The slow-witted ferret paused a moment, eyes blank, until a dim light flickered on in the back of his mind.
Oh yeah!
Yap disappeared up the stairs into the chamber above.
Now you just come right back in and make yourself comfortable,
Yip added, roughly shoving Stu to the back of the store.
Yep, will bring out the goods, shortly. He'll bring 'em out shortly. Have a seat.
Yip hauled out a folding chair from around the side of the counter and plopped Stu in it. Matrix mumbled, eyeing Yip suspiciously. He leapt off Stu's head and took up a perch on the edge of the counter.
I got it!
Yap's voice rang down the stairs.
I really got it!
A moment later he descended, a slim white box held under his arm. Yip stepped in front of his brother, halting Yap in his tracks.
Hold it.
He took the box, prying it just a crack open, and then nodded. When he turned around, that sly old grin was firmly back in place.
Well, son, this might not be exactly what you dreamed up, but it's pretty dang close.
Kind of a Western flavor,
Yap chimed in. Yip held the box forward and lifted the lid. Stu gasped as he laid eyes on the fabric inside. It was black, velvety, edged in shining threads of silver. On top of the suit were laid a matching Cordovan hat, black domino mask, and a belt from which hung a short rapier and pistol.
Try it on, bud, Yip urged. I can see it now. The world's shortest Zorro.
Gesturing towards Yap, he added,
Get a mirror, bro. Let the little fella see himself in this getup.
A moment later, Stu was standing in front of a mirror, admiring himself in the outfit. A cape trailed from his shoulders, the sword and pistol hung at his waist, and his little black eyes sparkled behind his mask.
It's poetry,
Yip announced. He kissed his fingers and flicked them towards the mirror.
Yeah, Yap agreed. I bet it'll knock your lady right off her feet.
Stu, however, wasn't quite convinced.
Looks a mite ruddy now I'm wearing it. Nothing ever looks the same on as off.
Yip dismissed Stu's concern with a wave.
You're lucky it looks as good as it does.
And that's mighty good,
Yap added.
Good? It's fantastic.
Yip laughed.
You look a dashing highwayman if ever I seen one.
Stu gazed into the mirror long and hard.
Well, maybe. How much is it?
Yap began to shout,
"Just do all the laughs we can get,"
when Yip clapped a hand over his mouth.
Well, I was hoping to get $10-15 for it, but seeing as we're friends, I'll let you take advantage of me and have it for $1.50.
Yip winked at Yap, causing his brother to break into a mad fit of giggles. Stu eyed them both, convinced the two were up to no good. However, the suit fit well enough, and as he tested the seams, they appeared strong and secure. The belt, likewise, was soundly made. Finally, he shrugged and handed over the proper change.
Okay, I'll take it.
"Right on, brother,"
Yap cheered. Yip beamed with feigned pride and saluted the shrew.
Knock her dead, son.
Matrix hummed in thought as he watched the whole exchange. He could sense something was wrong. He crawled along the counter, leapt to the wall, and continued out to the curtain as Stu strode into the open sun. Then Matrix slapped a limb over his eyes as everything became painfully clear. Uh-oh. Outside, Peter had just begun work on constructing the new wall and door for the Ferret brothers. He was the first to see Stu in his new getup. He shook his head for a moment in disbelief and wiped the sweat from his eyes. "Stu?"
Yeah, buddy, it's Stu. Barely recognize me, eh?
Peter nodded.
It's the suit, right?
"It's certainly different."
Dashing and adventurous, eh? Like Zorro?
Stu laughed a devil-may-care laugh.
Y'all see where Elizabeth went?
"I believe she went in there." Peter motioned over his shoulder to a nearby building. "I warned her to be careful. It isn't the most respectable establishment."
Really?
Stu fought to hide his excitement.
Well, I guess I better go see she's all right.
"Yes, I think you should," Peter agreed.
Well, I'll see you all round.
Stu waved and set off across the street. Peter stared after him, aghast, and turned to Matrix. "Zorro?" The spider sighed and shook his head. "You're right. He did look more like Elton John." Peter looked again to Stu. "You had better follow him, lad. There's no telling how they might react when he walks through those doors." The sounds of soft laughter and manic giggling floated out of the trading post as Yip and Yap watched.
Come on,
Yip whispered.
let's go see the look on everyone's faces.
"Yeah,"
Yap agreed.
"Riot."
Take a moment to think back to childhood. Do you recall those little toy cars that changed their colors under hot and cold water? Well, that costume Yip and Yap sold Stu was something like that. Already in the store, Stu's body heat had begun to affect it. Now, out in the hot sun, however, that black, bandit-like suit had turned a brilliant neon hot pink. It may, then, have been a small mercy that no one noticed Stu as he walked under the swinging double doors of the local saloon. The bar's patrons were instead all focused on a high-stakes poker game. The dealer was barely visible behind his winnings, just a white 10-gallon hat bobbing about behind stacks of coins, IOU notes, and even a few articles of clothing. The other players were visibly sweating, and not just because of the heat. One tugged at his collar and gulped. At last the dealer passed the deck to the right. A mouse in a sombrero reached out a shaking hand and cut it. Then the cards began flying rapid-fire across the table to the players, with the smooth speed and accuracy of someone that had spent many years perfecting their game. Stu glanced around the room. There was no sign of Elizabeth. Behind him, Matrix scuttled under the door, jabbering furiously. The spider crawled in front of Stu and pushed vainly against his knee. The shrew, however, didn't budge.
The game is 5-card stud. Ace is wild.
The dealer announced.
Ante is the best you can offer.
Stu's ears perked up at the voice.
Elizabeth?
"I fold," a mole with a thick handlebar mustache announced.
Stu!
The dealer exclaimed, hopping up in her chair. Elizabeth paused a moment, laying eyes on the Shrew's odd choice of outfit.
Stu?
From just outside there came the sound of Yap's mad giggling, followed by a dull thump, and then an ow! Stu looked around the room.
Elizabeth, what are y'all doing?
Well,
Elizabeth began, carefully gauging the mood of the other patrons. She could see a few of them starting to snicker. Elizabeth took a deep breath and launched into her story, hoping to divert attention away from Stu.
I had just been looking for a place to sit down and eat. When I came in here, these gentlemen
At this, she gestured to the other players.
asked me to join them in a game of poker. I told them I never gamble, but they insisted. And, well, I never gamble.
So y'all are fine?
Stu asked. Elizabeth nodded uneasily.
Y'all don't look fine.
Oh, I am, I promise.
Stu shrugged.
Well, maybe y'all just hang around to be safe. With a stack of money like that, y'all never know when some idiot'll try to rob you.
Elizabeth could see the motions of subdued chuckles spreading throughout her audience.
Stu, you really don't need to.
Yeah, I know, but I want to. Y'all are my special girl.
Stu, wait.
Elizabeth's voice dropped to an urgent whisper, but it was too late. Stu had already walked around the table and leaned casually against her chair. Elizabeth leaned close to the Shrew, and as softly as she could manage, she whispered,
Stu, look at yourself.
Hey,
Stu muttered, and did indeed look down at himself.
oh,
Stu, you'd better get out of here. Fast.
yeah, I better do that.
Stu gulped, every ounce of color draining from his face. Then, with the speed that only an emperor caught with no clothes can manage, he darted out the doors and took refuge around the corner, just out of sight. The moment Stu was gone, it was as if a rubber band, pulled to capacity, had finally snapped. The saloon erupted into raucous laughter. Patrons tumbled out of their seats and off their bar stools, and rolled laughing on the floor, clutching their sides. Darts flew out windows into whiskey bottles, and in a wild miracle of fate, dead center of the bullseye, as their thrower fought to contain himself. Through it all, there were, however, 4 people who were not laughing. Elizabeth, staring aghast at the scene around her, was one of them. The terrified card sharps, expectantly watching Elizabeth, were the others. When at last Elizabeth dumped her hat on the table and darted out the door, leaving her winnings behind, the 3 of them heaved a collective sigh of relief.
Well,
Stu gulped, looking up at the looming forms of Yip and Yap.
that sure didn't work out.
Yip ran a finger under the cape, feeling the fabric, and raised an eyebrow in mock surprise.
No wonder we got it so cheap.
Yap broke out into a mad fit of giggles, which came to an abrupt end when Yip hit him over the head.
Sorry.
Well, it still ain't over.
Yip announced, a sly glint entering his eye. Stu gulped.
Yeah, that's what I'm worried about. Well, don't worry,
Yip snapped. Flashing a sly grin, he added,
'cause I have a plan. Well, it better be a Lulu.
Yip winked at Yap.
Oh, it's a beauty.
Oh,
Yap exclaimed.
is this the one where...
Yip nodded.
Go get Yup.
Yup?
Yup. Yup.
Yup.
Yap dashed away, giggling every step.
Right.
And you, son, come with me.
Yip grabbed Stu under the arm and hauled him back to the trading post. By the time Elizabeth emerged from the saloon, they were already gone.
Stu!
She called out,
Stu!
but there was no answer. The Shrew had already been suckered into another scheme. Peter scratched his head as he watched Yip and Stu bluster into the trading post. A moment later, Matrix also returned. "How bad was it, lad?" Matrix forced a rapid-fire laugh. I see." Peter rubbed his chin and peered behind the curtain. "What do you suppose those weasels are up to now?" Matrix shrugged. "Better have a look, lad. Stu needs someone watching out for him. Matrix nodded in agreement and crawled under the curtain. From there, he skittered up the counter and promptly slapped his forehead upon laying eyes on the scene inside. "This one's on the house," Yip was saying. Stu, meanwhile, was eyeing himself in the mirror, no longer a pink Zorro, but now wearing a dull-colored duster and a brown leather cowboy hat.
"And y'all are sure this one ain't gonna turn pink?"
"Positive," Yip answered, as he surreptitiously poured glue into Stu's gun holster. "Uh-oh," Matrix squeaked.
"So I just walk back out there and... what?"
"Like I said, Yap's gonna get our cousin, Yup. Yup shows up, starts making a scene, and you have a gunfight. You know, quick draw, silly pose, that kind of thing."
"And I'm shooting blanks, right?"
Yeah, you're shooting blanks."
"And what if I'm too slow? He's shooting blanks too?"
"The blankest blanks that ever blanked."
"And everyone'll just forget the pink suit."
Yip grinned as he linked back against the counter. "Trust me, after this, they'll have a new story to tell about Stu the Shrew." "Uh-uh," Matrix shouted, leaping from the counter to a perch on Stu's hat. "Uh-uh!" He posed as if for a quick draw, then tugged vainly at his hip, pointed to the mirror, and faked a cruel laugh.
"What's the matter with y'all, Bug?"
Stu grumbled, shaking the spider from his hat. "He's just jealous," Yip assured the Shrew. "Everyone wants to be noticed, you know. Now, get on out there." Yip ushered Stu out the exit. "Give 'em a show they'll never forget." A low chuckle escaped Yip as he said it. "Ho ho." Taking a deep breath, Stu puffed out his chest and strode through the curtain with an exaggerated bow-legged gait. Matrix slapped his forehead in disgust. "Arg!" He skittered after Stu, crawling up the Shrew's back and chittering madly in his ear.
"Stop that, Bug Boy!"
Stu exclaimed, flicking a finger in the spider's face. Matrix sighed and shrugged towards the sky. He then rushed down Stu's back and crawled back to Peter. As Matrix squealed and chattered away, the rat rubbed his chin in thought, as if he understood what the spider was saying. "I see. This is bad." He stood up, glowering at the Yip and Yaps sign, and threw down his hammer. "Not at all cracking of them, I say. Not at all." Across the street, Elizabeth spotted Stu as he stepped into the open.
"Stu!"
she called to him. Stu stopped, glancing in Elizabeth's direction, and waved.
"Stu, thank goodness I've found you!"
Elizabeth exclaimed as she rushed up to meet him.
"Yeah, goodness would bring me round,"
Stu answered, puffing out his chest and gazing into the sky.
"Wherever there's trouble a-brewing, I'll be there. Wherever there's people crying for a hero, I'll be there."
Peter visibly cringed. "I'm not sure that's the best endorsement." Stu blinked and looked down, rubbing his eyes, the image of the sun briefly flashing in his vision.
"Remind me not to do that again."
"Stu, I was worried. After what happened in the saloon..."
That was just a little setback. As y'all can see, I'm fine now. Better than fine. Ha ha!
Elizabeth eyed Stu skeptically, looking him up and down from head to toe. She had the immense impression of looking at a young boy wearing his father's ill-fitting clothes.
"Are you sure?"
Am I sure?
Stu repeated, and attempted to fake a confident laugh. He failed.
Can anyone be sure of anything in a rough and tumble shoot-'em-up town like this?
Actually, it's been quite peaceful, Peter spoke up.
Ah, that's just a publicity stunt to bring in the tourists,
Yip yapped.
Just you wait, it'll heat up real soon.
He stifled a devious laugh. Elizabeth scowled at the ferret.
"Stu, what are you up to?"
Why, I ain't up to nothing.
Stu paced, bow-legged in a circle, making little ch-ching sounds with his teeth to mimic the rattle of spurs.
I just found my calling is all. Yes, ma'am, I know who I am.
And so does the rest of the town, Yip muttered. Elizabeth softly shook her head, her gaze remaining firmly planted on Stu.
"And who are you?"
Stu the Shrew!
A thunderous voice roared from the far end of the street. A hulking skunk cast his long shadow between the buildings, arms spread in the classic pose, fingers twitching by his sides. Stu gulped.
I'm a dead man.
Elizabeth glanced between Stu and the skunk.
Stu, what's going on?
Well,
Stu hesitated. Then it all clicked. This whole thing was just an act, he reminded himself. Grinning up at Elizabeth, he answered,
nothing y'all need to worry about. I can take this fella any day of the week. Where are you, boy?
The skunk barked.
You going to face me like a man, or do I have to smoke you out like a rat?
Peter grunted. Rather a personal remark, I say. Throwing his shoulders back and standing as straight and tall as his small frame could manage, Stu strode off down the street, projecting all the confidence of a little boy with a cap gun and a Halloween costume, playing make-believe.
Stu?
Elizabeth shouted, panic showing clearly in her eyes.
What are you doing?
What a man's got to do, Elizabeth,
Stu answered, without so much as looking back. Elizabeth looked helplessly to Peter.
Is he crazy?
Peter just frowned and shook his head. All around the town, locals peered out windows, and from behind curtains, and up from holes in the ground. As Stu and the skunk approached one another, the audience gathered and swelled. It was the most excitement they'd had since Elizabeth beat the card sharps at their own game.
Your friends tell me you're pretty good with a gun, boy,
the skunk growled. From behind him, Yap appeared, giving Stu the thumbs-up sign. Stu, however, felt his confidence waning. He had been expecting another ferret. This skunk, however, was a good deal larger, and he doubted the skunk had any relation to Yip and Yap.
Yup. I say you're a liar, boy,
the skunk barked. Quick as a flash, his left hand whipped a gun from its holster and fired a shot into the sky, drawing a surprised yelp from Stu.
I'm calling you out. Draw, or crawl back under your rock.
Stu whipped out a pencil and a scrap of paper and hastily scribbled out a crude rendering of a pistol. Holding it up, he flashed a sheepish grin.
Y'all satisfied?
The skunk's eyes flashed with anger.
Draw, varmint!
He fired several more shots, this time at the ground. Stu hopped about as they skidded past his feet. Leaning forward, Stu whispered,
Those didn't feel like blanks. Ain't y'all supposed to be shooting blanks? Draw!
All around him, Stu felt the town holding its collective breath. Elizabeth wrung her hands helplessly as she watched the standoff. Matrix hit his face against Peter's arm. Yip and Yap could barely contain themselves as they giggled in giddy anticipation. As the reality of his situation dawned on him, Stu felt a strange calm settle over him. He looked up at the skunk, a shred of steel flashing in his eye. Stu relaxed his arms, letting them hang loose at his sides. This was it. This was his moment. This was his fate. This was what heroes do.
Who y'all calling boy?
Faster than the eye could follow, Stu's hand flashed to his holster, and there it stayed for a very long time. Stu blinked. The gun didn't seem to want to come free. He tugged frantically. Still, it stayed where it was.
What's the matter, boy? Cat got your holster?
There was a sound of thunder. Stu winced.
That wasn't no blank.
Stu was, fortunately, not badly wounded. When his gun went off, the bullet had just grazed his leg, and ricocheted away when it hit the ground. That did not, however, mean it hurt any less. There was a light click, the sound of a gun cocking its hammer. Stu looked up into the barrel of the skunk's other gun.
Say your prayers, boy!
No!
Elizabeth cried out, dashing recklessly for Stu.
Please!
Stu began to beg, falling to his knee as he clutched at his leg. The skunk pulled his trigger. There was a light pop, and a little flag extended from the barrel with the word BANG written on the side. The skunk flashed a grin at the various bystanders.
Ain't I a stinker?
It was as if something in the collective consciousness had snapped. All at once the inhabitants of Fairville roared with laughter. All, that is, except four. One of them, Elizabeth, dashed to the side of another. A third one, Matrix, at her heels. The fourth, Peter, shook his head and left his job unfinished.
I'm sorry, Elizabeth,
Stu gasped.
Hush!
Elizabeth cut him off. Matrix passed her a cotton ball soaked in rubbing alcohol, and then set to work weaving a bandage from his silk, while Elizabeth cleaned out the wound. One by one, the voices of the town's inhabitants died away as they watched Elizabeth looking after the consequences of the performance. Even the skunk's expression had grown somber. He turned away and slunk into the saloon without another word. Only two voices now rang through the street, the harsh laugh of Yip and the manic giggling of Yap. Elizabeth laid eyes on each of them in turn. Yap met her glare head-on and crumbled under its intensity. He grew silent, gulped, and ducked out of sight. Yip, however, paid no attention. He simply slipped back inside the trading post. Elizabeth's brow furrowed, and her nostrils flared in rage. Once Matrix had fastened his homemade bandage around Stu's leg, Elizabeth took the shrew in her arms and carried him to the wooden walkway outside a nearby building.
It was all supposed to be an act, Stu tried to explain. I just wanted to be something, you know.
Wait for me,
Elizabeth ordered.
I'll be back shortly.
Stu's voice trailed off as Elizabeth whirled around and gave him a stern look.
I'm sorry, Elizabeth. I'm sorry.
Wait for me,
Elizabeth repeated. Then she set off for the trading post. Matrix dropped down beside Stu and rested a limb on his shoulder as if trying to comfort the shrew. Stu looked into the spider's eyes and immediately went cross-eyed from the sheer number of them and heaved a sigh.
I should have listened to y'all, Fuzzy. Y'all knew better than me.
Stu took off his hat and rubbed his sweaty brow.
Really was just a dream. Just a stupid dream.
In a sudden burst of anger, Stu hurled the hat as far as it would go into the street. It landed about an arm's length from him. Just then, a curtain hanging over the building's entrance fluttered with movement as a slender white arm drew it aside. "Pardon me, fella," a mouse spoke up from inside. "I couldn't help overhearing." She was snowy white, dressed in a navy-colored shawl and sky-blue skirt. "Having lady troubles?" Stu shrugged.
I'm starting to think I'm the trouble.
"I saw the standoff. Yip and Yap been giving you the runaround?" Stu nodded.
I've been a real sucker.
The mouse plopped down beside Stu, wrapping her arms around her knees. "Well, you're in good company. Half the guys in town are born suckers. It's how they end up out here."
Yeah, but I only want to be in her company, is my problem.
The mouse stuck a cigarette in her mouth and glanced over to Stu. "You got a light, fella?" Stu shook his head. "Just my luck," the mouse muttered and tucked her cigarette away under her shawl. "I haven't had the best run myself lately."
You too, huh?
The mouse nodded with a smirk. "I got suckered into treasure hunting myself. Some jerk sold me a map, said it led to all kinds of riches. The catch was, it was all buried out there." She motioned to the looming fairgrounds of the great apes in the distance. "I couldn't make it during the day. Too many great apes stomping around. I'd have gotten crushed or caught. During the night, this country gets even worse. Owls, diamondbacks, the works." Stu grunted.
Sorry to hear it.
"Yeah," the mouse stared dreamily into the sky. "It drives me nuts, just thinking about it. Gold, or maybe jewels, or even just a case of 10s and 20s. It's so blasted close, but always just out of my reach." Stu chuckled. So close, but just out of reach.
Reminds me of Elizabeth.
The mouse half snorted, half laughed. "I've got to level with you, friend. I was kind of hoping we could help each other." Stu's ears perked up. He He met the mouse's gaze with a suspicious look of his own.
Yeah, how so?
The mouse twisted around on her seat to face Stu, an eager grin on her face. You've got guts, fella. I was thinking you could take this map, find that treasure, and we split it. 50-50. Stu shook his head, chuckling ruefully. What?
Nothing. I'm just a bit scammed out. Try me again tomorrow.
The mouse gasped in mock outrage. Scam? If this were a scam, would I just hand over a treasure map and trust you're the honest type? Stu thought a moment.
Nah, y'all try and get something for it.
The mouse nodded. Yeah, I would. Stu shrugged.
Well, it's been one of those days.
One of those lifetimes, the mouse agreed. She stood up and leaned against the building, unfolding a worn roll of parchment and smirking every bit as ruefully as Stu on his worst day. Take a bit of advice, fella? Stu looked to Matrix for approval. The spider shrugged. Women only want two things, money and power, the mouse stated. You know, security. We want to be taken care of, land ourselves a good provider. So if you don't have one, you need the other.
Ha!
Stu laughed.
That explains my ex-wife.
There you go. The mouse paused a moment, biting her lip. So what'll it be, pal? Want to score the girl, or what? Stu looked to Matrix.
What y'all think, Fuzzit? Am I gonna make another stupid mistake?
Matrix mused. Eventually he shrugged.
I'm falling for it, ain't I?
Matrix shook his head furiously in protest.
Yeah, you're right. It's a mistake. But I sure wish I could make things up to Elizabeth.
Stu looked up at the mouse and nodded.
Deal. 50-50, like y'all said.
Matrix slapped his forehead in disgust. The mouse inclined her head, lightly nodding as she rolled up the map and began to hold it out. Before Stu could take the map, however, the mouse snatched it back. Now, fella, you have to remember, this is a big deal for me. Long as I have the map, I've got a chance. The moment I hand it over, my fortune's in your hands. Stu's face fell immediately.
Y'all are gonna ask for some kind of collateral, ain't you?
Afraid so, friend. What you got? Stu felt around in his pockets, finding only a handful of coins.
About $1.50.
I'll take it. The exchange was swift and irrevocable. As the coins left Stu's hands, a part of him knew he had been taken in yet again, but the pitch had been extremely convincing. To Stu, at least. Good luck, fella, the mouse called after him with a wave. Stu retrieved his hat, just so he could tip it to her as he limped into the sunset. Matrix sighed in disgust, knowing full well that Stu would need someone looking out for him. So the spider reluctantly scuttled after Stu, crawled up his back, and settled in atop his hat, as if riding in a crow's nest on a sailing vessel. Little did the three of them realize, however, that they had been watched. Yap had been hiding just around the corner, eavesdropping on every detail, and he was even more of a sucker than Stu. With the shrew now on his way, Yap darted back along a side route to bring the incredible news of buried treasure to his brother. Yip, however, wasn't having quite as good a time. If you'll recall, Elizabeth had been on the warpath after Yip and Yap's last stunt. As kind, demure, and sweet as she could be, Elizabeth also had a raging, venomous fire burning deep in her heart, and the sight of Stu on the ground while an entire town laughed at him was enough to bring it out. Yip was still chuckling when Elizabeth drew the curtain aside. She watched for a moment as Yip appeared to calm down. Then he burst out in laughter again, pounding his fist against the counter. Elizabeth faked a smile, though that toxic flame shone through her eyes.
You seem rather pleased with yourself.
Pleased? Ha!
Yip paused for breath.
Please don't begin to describe it. Did you see the look on that face when he realized the guns were loaded? And then, bang.
And did you see the look on his face when he knelt on the ground, clutching his knee?
No, but I bet it was priceless.
I know I wouldn't pay to see it.
Hey, I got rid of him, didn't I? You should be thanking me.
Elizabeth hopped onto the counter and casually strolled in Yip's general direction.
He happens to be a good friend of mine.
Really? That's not the vibe I was getting when I met you two.
Stu can be a pest.
Elizabeth admitted.
That just means he needs a firm hand. He does not need someone like you to humiliate him in front of the town.
Maybe not, but it sure was fun.
Elizabeth gave a mirthless chuckle.
I see. Well then, Mr. Yip.
Sugar, how many times I gotta tell you, it's yippee to you.
Elizabeth inclined her head to the side and continued.
Mr. Yip, here's what's going to happen. I am going to walk out that door. I am going to find my friend and bring him right back here. Then you, sir, are going to pay him back every penny you took from him, and you are going to apologize for everything you've done, and you will mean every word of it. Is that clear?
Yip rolled his eyes.
Yeah, and what if I don't?
Elizabeth leaned forward, resting her elbows on a paperweight and cupping her chin in her hands.
There are a great many card sharps in the saloon, in a great deal of debt to me. I expect they would do a great deal to square away those debts.
The mirth vanished from Yip's eyes. His mouth twisted into an angry snarl.
It's a long way from here to the saloon.
He began to reach under the counter.
I wouldn't do that.
Elizabeth piped up.
Yeah, why not?
Didn't you yourself say that very few women pass through town?
Yeah, what about it?
Elizabeth flashed a sly grin.
What happens if a woman goes missing or turns up dead? I think the men of this town would want an explanation, don't you?
Yip paused.
Well,
Or maybe a scapegoat. People tend to like those, someone to blame for their troubles. As the last person to see me alive, you would be the perfect candidate.
Leaning closer, Elizabeth added,
Do you know what tends to happen to scapegoats?
Yeah, of course I do. What happens?
Elizabeth said nothing, but simply glanced to a coil of rope sitting on a nearby shelf. Yip gulped and withdrew his hand.
Do we understand each other?
Yip didn't answer. He took a step back towards the wall with a low growl.
I'm glad to hear it.
Elizabeth concluded and hopped down from the counter. Yip watched her leave, teeth bared but useless. He felt impotent, helpless. It was not a feeling Yip enjoyed, but there was nothing he could do except what he had been told to do. Yet only a few moments later, all that changed, as Yap breezed in through the curtain, as exuberant and eager as a hyperactive puppy.
Yip, Yip, he yapped. You'll never guess what I just heard.
You'll never guess what I just heard,
Yip snarled back.
Really? What'd you hear, bro? Huh? What'd you hear?
Yip rolled his eyes at the ceiling and growled.
Will you just shut up?
No time for that, bro. No time.
Yap raced in circles around the store, peering in corners and under shelves.
What are you doing?
Yap popped up from behind a clothing rack, a boot perched precariously on his head.
I just found out this treasure on the fairground.
Yeah, leftover food. So?
No, the buried kind.
What, you mean like pirates?
Or gangsters. I don't really know. But there's really a treasure out there.
Really?
Yip's voice dripped with skepticism.
And, how'd you find out?
'Cause the little guy's got a map.
Does he now?
Yeah, he got it from Miss North. I don't know where she got it, but she's no idiot, so if she believed it, it must be real.
Yip leaned back against the wall and crossed his arms. On one hand, he wasn't as gullible as his brother, and he smelled a rat. On the other hand, Yip was no genius himself, and the visions of gold, silver, and jewels floating before his eyes made a very compelling case.
Yep, we still got those suits.
What, you mean?
Yeah, the ones I lifted from Universal.
Yeah, I think so.
Yip nodded with a grin.
Good. You round 'em up while I fire up the secret weapon.
That evening, as the sun dipped towards the horizon, many stories would be shared throughout the town of strange lights in the sky. In the meantime, however, Elizabeth emerged from the trading post to find Stu missing. She called out for him, fully believing the sight before her, but not entirely sure what to do now.
Stu!
Elizabeth poked about the ground for a scent, and then raised her nose, nostrils flaring as she sniffed the air. Cupping her hands to her mouth, she called out again.
Stu!
Far away, walking the arid, dusty landscape between Fairville and the Great Apes Fairgrounds, Stu heard Elizabeth's voice. He turned back a moment in the direction the call had come from, and very quietly he answered.
I know I've been a pest, Elizabeth. Y'all deserve better. So I'm gonna be better. I'll make it all up to you. I promise.